Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. And on this episode, we're joined by Joel Johnson, the Chief Strategy Officer at Admirable Devil. That's the agency behind creative campaigns like Zonker Time with Zonker for scientific anglers. Prior to co-founding Admirable Devil, Joel was the Chief Marketing Officer for Trout Unlimited. In our interview, we discuss his early passion for fishing and conservation, how the Great Recession helped him refocus his purpose, and we take a deep dive into the state of the sport. A couple of housekeeping items, though, before we move on to the interview. If you like the podcast, please share it with a friend and leave us a review in the podcatcher of your choice. And then shout out to this episode's sponsor. This episode's sponsored by our friends at Norvise. Their motto is tie better flies faster, and they produce the only vise that truly spins. To see for yourself, visit www.nor-vice.com, or even better, visit with them at any of the fly fishing shows. Now on to our interview. Well, Joel, welcome to The Articulate Fly.
Thank you very much, Marvin. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I am too, and we have a tradition on The Articulate Fly. I always like to ask all of my guests to share their earliest fishing memory.
That's a good one, and it's a great question because almost immediately, like, this vision popped in front of my mind of my earliest fishing memory. It would be back in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, in the early 80s, fishing with my dad and my brothers and sisters on Shadow Lake, which was this little suburban lake, kind of in a quiet rural area, full of stock trout, the occasional bass. And we would picnic there and inevitably bring fishing poles, set them up on the bank, get a big, tub of night crawlers or dig for crawlers right there. Let them sit there and bob. And I remember the very first fish I caught was a rainbow trout. And I was so proud of it. The bottle went down, I pulled it out myself. My dad's behind me, I'm reeling it in. And like, my dad takes it off the hook, whacks it, and he's like, "We're going to eat this trout." We brought it home. I mean, I would not eat a stalker today, but it was incredible to kind of see that full circle, and have that experience and eat it. It was kind of cool. And my dad was a big time angler. And when we fished so often on Lake Erie and in the rivers and the tribs there, he really was the reason why I fell in love with the outdoors and being outside and just sort of constantly trying to find ways to kind of connect. So, yeah, thanks for that. That's actually a great memory, Marvin.
Yeah, that's really neat. And so you started, fishing with night crawlers. When did you move to the dark side of fly fishing?
Much later in life, actually. I fished. I'm 45, and I fished most of my life as a traditional kind of spin fisherman. I picked up fly fishing because it was 2007 or 2008, I think. The recession hit, and I got laid off from work. And it was interesting because I had been going full steam throughout my life, just head down, working hard. And when I got laid off, I got a severance package. And my other passion and hobby in life is to write. And so I did a lot of writing during that period, and I did a lot of fishing. And I was like fishing at a lake, a reservoir in Westchester, New York, just north of Manhattan. And that's where I was living at the time. And I would go up to the reservoir with my spinning gear, and I'd walk around this massive reservoir. And you could see schools of fish. I mean, this was a beautiful, clear water, the water that basically, Manhattan drinks, New York City drinks. And you'd cast in, and reservoirs are deep and cold. And I would catch the occasional trout, a lot of lake trout here and there. But it was never like stellar fishing, And yet, then I'd go home, I'd look online, I'd see this guy pull out this, chunky 6-7 pound, 8 pound brown trout. I'm like, I want to get that fish, So I just kept looking for ways to kind of like work that reservoir. And one day I saw some guys walking by in waders and carrying fly rods. And I'm like, where the hell are they going? Because I know they're not going to, fly fish here on this lake. And they sort of disappeared into the woods, and I sort of followed them. And they were going down to the outflow of the reservoir. And that's when it kind of like hit me that the reservoir, where did this water come from? Like it came in somewhere and it came and went out somewhere, right? I was like, there's a tailwater down here, And so I went down and I saw them fly fishing. I thought that's really cool. I watched them catch, and I was like, I got to try that. And soon after, I was taking classes in fly fishing. I convinced a bunch of my buddies to go up to Joan Wolf's school up in the Catskills for a couple of days and take her classes with her incredible staff, folks like Dusty Wismith and so forth. And I learned to fly fish there. And then when I got back to the city, and I still was on my forced sabbatical, I would zip in my car, my little Prius. I'd zip up to the reservoirs, and I stopped fishing the reservoirs altogether, and I just fished tailwaters in between them. And the coolest thing, I tell you, one of the most unknown, coolest things about New York City is that you can be trout fishing within an hour of being in like one of the busiest, densest places in the world. If you can figure out what are the resources around you. And so you've got all these little cool little tribs and rivers and creeks in Connecticut, which is only an hour and 20 minutes from downtown New York. Or you can hit the reservoirs, and there's like 7 or 8 major reservoirs there, all connected by tailwaters, all cold, clean water running in between, all, some cases stocked with trout, but in many cases you got these holdover browns and rainbows that push up from the reservoirs at certain times into the creeks, especially when there's good hatches. And then there's some wild trout in there as well. So it was like, I always felt like it was a little secret. There's maybe 10, 20 guys who knew about it. And I spent a year fly fishing and learning how to fly fish and teaching myself success, failure, the whole nine there. And it just became something I was like, this is so important to me. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And like, I want this to be that thing that I just do, that I need, to take a break, de-stress, unwind, So that's how I got started. That's how I went to the dark side.
What really drew you into fly fishing, right? I mean, because it sounds like you've shifted away from spinning fishing to fishing all fly fishing now.
Yeah, I'm pretty much 100% fly, and it's because of the challenge of it, the connection of it, and also the level of engagement. I know some guys who make their own plugs, but I love the idea of tying a fly, going out, experimenting with it, catching a fish on it. I love the idea that every time I go to a stretch of river, it's going to be different. The environment's going to be different. The weather's going to be different. The fish are going to be different. The little challenges on that river are going to be different, especially if you fish a piece of water for a long time, you watch it change, And the thing that I love about the fly fishing experience too is there's a little bit of like you get to explore, depending on your water. I remember here's a great example, right? So 30 years of basically standing on the damn bank, on the dock, on the pier, on the boat. The first time I put waders on and I stepped into the river, I was like, this is a completely different experience. You feel the river pushing against your legs. And like now, of course, I take it for granted, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours on the water. But like that first experience of pushing against the water, wading upstream, you get a good rip and you kind of lift your legs up and you float a little bit downstream to your next hole. It's a completely different experience being in the water. So when you're wade fishing, being on a river, or even when you're on a boat, right, on a guided trip, you're floating down river and the river is constantly changing. And that dynamic really appeals to me. Whereas the spin dynamic just felt so much more static, so much more boring, you know?
Yeah, that's really neat. I mean, I know for me, it's the one of the few things that I do that kind of soaks up all of that mental capacity. And to your point, it's different every day, even if you go to the exact same place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, because of those differences, it forces you to fish differently. And then, you dig your heels in, you get real stubborn. You say, I'm going to just do it this way. I'm just going to do it this way. Why isn't this way working? And then, because you never can stop learning fly fishing, you go and you start studying and reading and you find other ways, and that is cool. That is just cool. Like, you can always keep learning.
Yeah. And I think, one of the biggest lessons is you have to take what the river gives you, which for type A people like me, I find to be a pretty important lesson.
I like that. I'm going to remember that one.
Yeah. So we fast forward, you had your forced sabbatical, you were living in the city, and I know now you live in the nation's capital. Tell us a little bit about the fisheries in your area.
Yes. So I live in Washington, D.C. I've been living here for about 8 years. I've got to know the fisheries around here. And it's been interesting because obviously we have this, we're at the confluence of two rivers, the Anacostia and the Potomac. And the Potomac at its headwaters is a trout river. Way up in its headwaters, you're going to find brook trout. And then you're going to find trout, from West Virginia and into Maryland. And for about a good 10, 12 miles, it's like basically a tailwater. And then it warms up and then it turns into a smallmouth bass fishery. And it's an epic smallmouth bass fishery. What's really cool about being in DC is that, those two rivers, the confluence is right here. And then, just a handful of miles downriver, another 40, maybe 50 miles, you hit the bay. And so there's like a lot of opportunities in this region. So I can go and put my rod in the car, which I almost always have, and go down to Fletcher's Cove. And depending on the weather at the time of year, I can catch smallmouth bass, catfish on the fly, panfish. And then, of course, we have this annual run of American and hickory shad on all our rivers. That is just a spectacularly fun time. Catching anadromous fish, within sight of the Capitol. It's just really cool, particularly in Fletcher's Cove. It's a little valley, and it's below Great Falls, which is a spectacular national park if you've ever been there. And it's rocky and fun. And, behind you is Georgetown University, but you can't really see it through the trees. It's kind of covered. And then above you, there's a highway. But then you're looking up and you're seeing bald eagles, you're seeing ospreys, you're seeing cormorants. You're looking down, you're seeing turtles and great blue herons and egrets. It's a really green city, It's just, it's busy, just like any other place, but it's rich in resources. And so I like to fish. What's interesting, I was a trout guy for a very long time, and then really started to expand into warm water fishes, and now I have a really eclectic mix, and that's because of where I live. And then we're not too far from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, maybe an hour and a half. And so there's trout up there, brook trout through to, stock trout. And there are some pretty half decent wild trout rivers as well. And then it's interesting because DC is kind of like smack in the middle between Maryland, Virginia. We're really close to the Pennsylvania border. So one thing I love to do when it's just kind of hot and humid and busy and DC kind of getting to me, I will just hop in the car and sneak up to the limestone spring creeks of Pennsylvania, which is like an hour and a half away. Like, it's crazy the amount of opportunity we have, in this area. And there, you're going to find spring creek trout, picky, technical waters, different challenge altogether, different kind of fishing. So I feel blessed, honestly, to live here. It's not like the rat race of New York. It's slower. I think DC is more of a southern city. It's green. We don't have high buildings, and there's a lot of good fishing around me. So Plus, I get to go over to Chesapeake Bay for stripers and bluefish when I want to. I mean, I kind of have it all here.
No, it sounds like it. Do you have a favorite species you like to target? I mean, I know you're lucky with the diversity, but if you could only fish for one type of fish on the fly, what would it be?
Oh, that's not fair. Okay. Probably smallmouth bass. Probably smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass can be as wily and technical as any other fish, but they can also be reckless and stupid. And they can also they fight, inch for inch, pound for pound. They are incredible fish. They're strong. They're smart. They have incredible camouflage. In certain rivers, near me, depending on the water clarity, the sight fishing for smallmouth bass can be spectacular. You're floating down. Certain guides now will have a pulling platform, and you're inching along, trying not to spook that fish, and you see them, at 20, 25 yards, 30 yards. Got to put out a bomber cast, but not disrupt, just not disrupt things. You get good cicada or moss hatches, and you're fishing under the trees, and then the water just explodes. It's a great fish. It's a great, great fish. And I think it's a little more forgiving in terms of the environment. You can find, obviously, smallmouth in very cold waters, as well as in warm waters, And so, for this particular region, it's plenty plentiful. And so it's a good fish to target.
Yeah, no, I enjoy fishing for smallies in Central Virginia, where I grew up too. And, as we've been kind of talking today, and I know from your background too, that you're very, very interested in conservation and stewardship. And I was curious where that interest came from and how you made the decision, once you were interested in it, to how you wanted to participate in the conversation.
Yeah, that's so this is actually one of those early memories for me. Just to go back to Cleveland, Ohio for a second, and the suburbs of Cleveland. So I was living in a suburb called Oakwood, and it was an area that just was going through a slow amount of transformation. We were in a ranch house, and my neighbor on my right side was a farmer with pigs, chickens, lamb. Neighbor on the left side, farmer, pigs, chicken, lamb. And but we were in sort of a 1950s ranch house, and there were a few of them dotted in the area. And it was a kind of a mixed community. And I remember I'd go back into my backyard, and then it was like down a hill, and then you could just go off into some land that just didn't seem like anybody owned it. Just stretched on, and it was like this sort of magical forest that me and my brothers and sisters and my friends, we always could play in. And there was a grove of pine trees back there. And how pine trees are. The needles fall on the ground, and it makes it all quiet, and everything gets still. And it's a different kind of forest experience. And it was a sanctuary. It was a spiritual place for me, And I remember one year getting my buddies and got on our bikes and dirt bikes, went out in the backyard, found the trails, and we're heading up to that pine tree forest. And we got there, and it was gone. And literally, like, no trees. And there was a bulldozer sitting there. And then as I looked past the bulldozer, I could see, the suburban sprawl. And I felt like I lost something, I felt like I lost something. And so that's always been like a kind of like a big part of who I am. Just, the idea that there are some places that are important, that are special, that are worth protecting. And then that, when they're gone, And so I've always been deeply connected to conservation. And when after my sabbatical, and I started to look at like how I was going to live my life going forward, I'm basically a 25-year advertising industry veteran. I was like, I got all these freaking superpowers to convince people to buy sugar water and hot dogs and life insurance. I'm like, I need to be using some of this stuff for good. and I started to actively seek out opportunities to, tell stories, use communication, make advertising, to be more persuasive, to protect the things that we love, to leave the world just a little bit better place than we found it.
Very neat. And, for our listeners that don't know, you were the chief marketing officer for a while at Trout Unlimited. And, so many of us that angle try to figure out how to make our day job and our fun job mesh. Tell us a little bit about how you made that transition. You started telling stories that were more meaningful to you from a conservation perspective, but how did you end up at Trout Unlimited?
Yeah, so I left New York City, moved down to DC to work at an agency that actually did work on some social issues. They worked on politics, of course, being DC, but they worked on social issues, and they had a really good client set. And it was good, and the work was very fulfilling. I got to know some people down here in conservation, including the former chief marketing officer at TU. And I always said, hey, if you ever leave that place, call me. I might want your job one day. And I was just happening one randomly on, I think it was LinkedIn or something, and I saw that Trout Unlimited was advertising for a chief marketing position. I was like, oh my God, this is right here in town. And this is exactly right. This would be a dream job. I get to do all those things that I want to do, and it's connected so deeply to the sport of fishing. I was like, I got to go for this. So I think I wrote a letter and sent in my resume. I didn't hear back for 2 weeks. And I was like, man, that's ridiculous. I mean, I would think that they would want to give me a shot. I'm right here. I got the skill set. So I called and I said, did you, and I called HR. I said, did you get my resume? And they were like, no, what are you talking about? I was like, ah. I sent it over, and literally, I think it was later on that afternoon, the CEO, Trout Unlimited, Chris Wood, called me. And he's like, I need to see you tomorrow. And we came in, and he and I chatted. We went for a walk, actually. It was it was actually during that walk that I knew that this would be the right place for me. We walked across the street from Arlington down to a little island in the Potomac River that's been turned into the memorial, the Roosevelt Memorial. And we walked through the memorial together, and we talked. And he was like, this is a tough job. This is a very, very dedicated, fiercely loyal, passionate community with a long history. And, it won't be an easy thing, if you want to do it. But it'll be rewarding. And pretty much, very soon after, I met with the rest of the team, and I was like, yeah, I want to go for this. I want to try this out. So as soon as I remember, after I took the job, I changed my title on LinkedIn, and so many people in the advertising industry that I know reached out to me and were like, man, congratulations. Especially guys and gals who fly fish. They were like, how did you pull that off? You get to go and, market a storied, incredible brand, fight for conservation and fish. How the hell did you do that? So it was right time, right place, and, right level of passion.
Yeah, that's great. And I know during your tenure there, you guys really made some major changes to the way TU marketed to their members and to the general public. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those changes and maybe highlight one or two of them that you're most proud of?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I think when I got there, one of the things and the tasks that I had was to sort of address the stark realities of what TU as an organization was going through, and actually still continues to go through. So, great organization, historical. Predominantly, its membership is made up of white males who are over the age of 55. And in fact, it's really actually I think it's higher than that. It's over the age of 60. And the reality was that, their 70 and 80-year-old members were literally dying out. And so you had an organization that wasn't growing, its membership was sort of flat and static. And, when you lose the membership, what you lose is the power of a voice for conservation. And so I looked at the challenge and said, okay, we need to tell a story that's going to be exciting and more interesting to more people. And then secondly, the marketing operations hadn't really changed in 20 years. And, we weren't tapping into social media. We weren't tapping into digital marketing. We weren't using our database very effectively to target new members based on their interests. We had a very, very clunky website. And we are also challenged by the operational nature of how TU works, which is that TU is it's really an alliance of independently run statewide trout unlimited organizations across the country, and then there's a centralized, national organization that administers to those statewide organizations. But the statewide organizations have a tremendous amount of independence and authority in their locations. But then, if you look at where the money flows from, the majority of the money that supports TU comes from grants and endowments and so forth for doing the hard science, the technical work that is done and most often led by the national organization. But no, that's not to say that the states don't do their own technical work. They do, but from a size of grant and size of funding position, they're pretty dramatically different. In fact, TU, as the nation's oldest cold water conservation organization, also is the recipient of the lion's shares of funding from private foundations and organizations, as well as public and government sources for cold water conservation and restoration. So what that means is here you have all this money kind of coming in, and it may work out that a project like the Clark Fork in Montana is going to receive an outsized amount of money and support than say Jones Creek in Tennessee. And it's a scenario where it's like it causes conflicts, and it's a constant balance to share and educate the membership on how and why TU National makes the choices that it makes and how it prioritizes how it spends things, against its sort of larger national scope versus the individual scopes. And so, my challenge there also at TU was to help build relationships through our storytelling, right, that would make sure that Jones Creek's story is prominently told as much and as often as the story of, say, the Clark Fork, right? And then when I was there, you asked me, what things am I proud of? There were definitely two or three things. Almost as soon as I arrived, the Wild Steelhead Initiative took off in the Pacific Northwest and West. And that was funded by a number of private sources, major donors, including some brands that and many government funds to basically find ways to study, protect, conserve wild steelhead populations. And as you probably know, and many of your listeners, steelhead is probably the most contentious species that we fly fish and angle for in the States because of systemic blows to populations from damming, from energy extraction, from the introduction of recreational fishing, hatchery fishing, and so forth. And so what TU was calling for was an alliance between a lot of different forces in steelhead conservation to really work on this bigger issue, create a formal environment. And I remember Rob Nasanis, a good friend and one of the most talented people I've ever worked with, who's the VP of Western Conservation, came to me and he was kind of giving me a little test. He's like, all right, new guy, you're supposed to be the marketing guru. How do we tell this story? What do we call it? And how do we go out and market it? And I was like, shit, I don't know, man. But I dug in, I did research, I traveled out there, I interviewed people, I brought in some really talented copywriters and art directors that I'd known from previous agencies, and we created Wild Steelheaders United, which was essentially a campaign to create the alliance and get in there and dig into the work. And out of that came a fresh new website, events and activities, and then a really great editorial slate of foundational pieces of research and reporting that helped communicate to the wider organization why it was important to protect America's steelhead. And especially, look, if you're a tailwater guy from Atlanta, who's more interested in your brook trout in the up in the Blue Ridge than you are in wild steelhead in Washington State, you got to find common ground. You got to tell a story in a way that brings those things together. And I was really lucky to have Kirk Dieter as the editor of Trout Magazine, and a special human all around in terms of his ability to craft and curate great stories. He was able to take the initiative and extend it into trout, which was our number one tool for making those for disseminating information. And then Chris Hunt, brilliant reporter, kind of old gumshoe reporter style kind of guy. He really fell in love with the social and visual opportunities, and he began to really blog in earnest about it, push it out to social, and suddenly it just felt like there was momentum. Like suddenly it was like, hey, TU's telling its story. You know what I mean? Like I'm bumping into it. And it's not just in Trout Magazine, but like I'm opening it up to the Des Moines Register, or I'm opening it up New York Times, or I'm going onto my Instagram feed, and I'm seeing this organization that I've been spending $35 a month on dues for years, really starting to talk back, talk about what it really cares about, and it was like this great energy, it was a big shift. And that, I think a lot of it started in that steelhead campaign because it was the test. It was like when we marshal our forces, and tell a great story, it can work. So that was the first thing I was proud of. The second thing was, and this was just a small functional operational change. So when I arrived, I got told, here's your team, and I'm looking at the team, and frankly, nobody was based in DC. I was the only one, but I had writers spread throughout the country. I had photographers, I had graphic designers, editors. And I was like, whoa, this is basically a 25-person team, and they're not organized. They don't talk to each other. They're not coordinated. So I sort of said, look, we need to treat this like an in-house agency where everyone has beats and assignments and roles, but we're working on a collective mission with an editorial calendar and a content calendar that's going to be consistent, and we're going to report in on that. And then we're going to measure it and see what's getting traction. We're going to measure our media impressions, something that the organization had never done. We're going to measure our PR impressions, and we're going to communicate this back to the board so that the board knows that we are a force to be reckoned with and that we're actually getting better at our job. And that is going to open up, more support when we want to do crazier things, more money, when we want to, explore different media and formats. And so that operational shift, I'm extremely proud of it. It still exists today. It's now under Kirk Dieter, who's basically the VP of marketing, and he runs it like an agency. And, bringing that into the organization, I'm extremely proud of that. I think it's had an enormous effect on the way that TU has been able to effectively tell its story. So there's a lot of other things I could talk about. We rebranded. It was really just a refresh of the logo, which was feeling really dated and needed, a lot of love. That was a deeply political process, which I don't want to go into. But at the end of the day, little things like that, they also do make a difference. And then look, what's that old adage, like, if you're not getting, if people aren't talking about you, you're not doing your job. So it was like, sometimes we get a lot of negative critiques, but that's to you, right? I mean, we all know how fly anglers can be. We're very picky people.
Fair enough. And, we fast forward a little bit, and you left TU after a bit of time, and you were a co-founder of an agency called the Admirable. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there, working with folks in the fly fishing industry? Yeah,
absolutely. So it was a really difficult choice to leave TU. Partly it's because I sort of was like, okay, I think I've done as much as I can for right now. And I saw in organizing the internal agency at TU, I saw, okay, that long-standing dream I have of basically owning my own agency someday, maybe now is the time. And so some former colleagues from other agencies that I'd worked with, we all came together and said, we want to start a new firm. And we're going to take all our principles with us, all the things we care about, like trying to, like I said, leaving the world a little bit better, telling a great story. And we founded Admirable Devil. We're based here in DC. And I've been very, very fortunate because I made such great relationships throughout the fly fishing industry. I've been able to actually have some fly fishing clients, which is just phenomenal. For example, the Orvis Company, Scientific Anglers, and then on the conservation side, Bonefish Tarp and Trust. And it's because, I'd walk in a room and talk to them about their marketing problems, and they knew they could trust me. They knew I cared as much about what the resources they did, but I also cared about the products, and I cared about storytelling. And so I got opportunities to kind of bring my life along with me into my work. And then we have a bunch of other clients in other sectors like technology and education. We actually just won a beer brand for the first time, which is super exciting. Every agency wants a good beer brand. So we're working with Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. Interestingly enough, they have a long-standing commitment and passion to the outdoors and actually have supported TU in California in different ways. The founder, Ken Grossman, has done that. The other thing is that they saw our work with Orvis, and that had a big impact on how we got invited to the table to help tell their story. And so that's what we'll be working on in 2020. So I keep getting lucky, but I do think it kind of goes down to that forced sabbatical all those years ago where I got to re-examine my life and, reprioritize the things I care about. And today, the best thing about owning the agency is that when I want to take the day off and go fishing, well, I don't have to call in because I'm the boss.
Yeah. I'm similarly situated, and I agree completely.
Yeah. It's a nice perk.
Yeah. And so as we kind of shift to kind of thinking about the kind of the industry and kind of how it's put together, I think all of us that spend a lot of time around fly fishing understand, and it's not just unique to fly fishing. I mean, it's other hunting and other outdoor activities too. We see this concern that we all have about decreased participation, this desire to grow the sport. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of where we are today and kind of how we got there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting times, isn't it? Because, so here's what I've been having this conversation now for a few years with folks about decreased participation in the outdoors. And we're seeing some just disturbing things. And it starts with a bigger trend, which is it's a larger decrease in participation in the outdoors writ large. Last year, literally, and I just don't understand this figure. I saw it in the news. I couldn't believe it. Half of people did not even get outside to recreate. Half of the country's population. And I'm just like, that's mind-boggling. How is that possible? That half the country didn't go for a walk in the park? Half of the country didn't take their kids skiing? Half the country didn't lift a fishing pole? Half the country, didn't drive out to a farm and let the dogs run? And it's blowing my mind. I think we're in real trouble. If we lose our connection to the outdoors, we lose our passion and our reasons for protecting the outdoors. And plus it's just good for our general health. And so I'm particularly interested in increasing participation for people of color, brown and black folks, indigenous folks, who aren't just they're not typically seen as being outdoor participants, which is very, very weird. And I say that it's weird because if you go back 60, 70, 80 years ago, you're going to find lots of people of color, not concentrated in the cities, but concentrated in rural areas, farming, doing all kinds of things. having a connection with the outdoors. But then you got the Great Migration in the early 1900s. You have immigration and waves of jobs and taking place in the industrial north, and it concentrates populations. And so what's happened is that folks have just, particularly communities of color, have been now, rerouted to these urban landscapes and living an urban lifestyle and not getting out, and not getting advantages to being out, not being seen as outdoor populations, not getting the same access to the outdoors, and all the wonderful benefits that come with that. So I'm particularly interested in seeing the fly fishing community grow, and I think that a big opportunity that what fly fishing can do for you is it can get you outdoors to interesting, beautiful places. It can get you into, doing fun activities that stimulate both the mind and the body. And so I really think that there's an opportunity for the sport to overall refresh its population and its community, bring more people in. Like I said, the majority of fly anglers are old white men and they're dying. Where is this population going to come from? This future population? You look at the larger demographic trends in the United States, and the United States is getting browner, it's getting more diverse, it's becoming more female. This is where we need to be drawing our future conservationists from, our future anglers from. Now, that's not to say, we're not going to talk to the regular old white guy, but we already know the regular old white guys out there fishing. Just go to an F3T event. You walk into that theater, and you see a bunch of young white guys. They get it. They love it. They got passion for it. Let's get more people in there. Let's get more people of color engaged. Let's get younger people engaged. Let's get more women engaged. And to do that, we have to do two things, I think. In one setting, in places like F3T and Trout Unlimited and fly fishing classes and so forth, we have to make room. We have to make the room and understand that everyone was a beginner at some point, and make room at the table for them. So that's like, basically communicating, right? Making sure you're communicating in an inclusive way, and there's a lot of different ways to do that, a lot of different tips. And the interesting thing is that the fly fishing industry doesn't have to make this stuff up, because there's other outdoor recreational industries that have been working on this far longer with far more success that they could turn to as an examples, including climbing, which one could argue is very niche, golf, tremendous amount of inclusivity in the last 30 years, again, an outdoor recreation activity, biking, cycling, running. There are many, many other sports that are doing it, actively been doing it well, and they've already seen 10-year, 20-year upticks in participation, as well as in more inclusive memberships. So that's one thing, making room at the table. The other thing we need to do is, and this is more internally within those communities of color, is just be more supportive of them. So there are plenty of communities of color that fish. I mean, frankly, when you look at the TU membership and you kind of break it down by the numbers, and you look at a place like California, you're going to see a lot more people of color in TU. Asian, Hispanics. Why? Because that's the makeup of California. You know what I mean? So, don't be surprised if you go to, say, New Mexico to fish, the San Juan, and you're fishing next to a Mexican. Not only was it his land, or her land indigenously, 300 years ago, but they live there now. They've never not lived there. So, if you walk down to the river and there's a Mexican person fishing there, whether they're fly fishing or spin fishing, you can't come at it with the attitude of, well, do they belong here? And so, there's communities of color, Asian communities along the Pacific Northwest, for example, that fishing is a huge part of their lifestyle. They brought it with them when they immigrated, and they continue to do it there locally. And then, of course, you have indigenous communities whose waters and lands have been, appropriated. And you'll find a lot of indigenous communities of color are trying to now reestablish their connections with waters and lands that their ancestors used. And fishing is a big part of that. Sometimes we always think of it as fishing as subsistence, or part of ritual, but it's bigger than that. It's also recreational and cultural. And so, when we need to support a community's beliefs about how they want to engage with that water, that means basically sort of say taking off your hat, which is like, well, I just want to fly fish that river, and if you undam it, it's going to go up a few degrees, and I'm just not going to support trout anymore. So I'm against it. Versus an indigenous population saying, hey, 500 years ago, my people fished this river. I've lived on this river my whole life. Previous generations have lived on this river. We like to see it restored, conserved, protected, and restored. And does that mean we lose a trout population? Yes, we may lose that trout population. But at the same time, what do we gain? We may gain something greater, a deeper connection, to that water, and a restoration, And look at the positive stories out there that are examples of when you do it right, everybody benefits. And I think a great example of that is Pyramid Lake in Nevada, which is, as you may well know, most of it is on a reservation and protected. And you need to get permission from the tribal community there to fish it. Well, they've been working hand in hand with conservationists, scientists, and biologists, not only that are working directly for the native population there, but also with the state and federal resources to restore the Lahontan cutthroat. And man, that is an incredible fish. And it's not just about Pyramid Lake, it's about those tribs where the fish spawn. And it's a great story because you created a powerful, amazing fishery that is rooted in the culture of its original cultures. And at the same time provides a wonderful recreational opportunity. It's on so many fly anglers' bucket lists now. Thanks also due in part to social media and digital and spreading the word about the fishery, and then also seeing black and brown faces, on Instagram, in social media, caring for these animals, fishing for these animals. And it's just it's the kind of thing that we need more of across the country, I think.
Yeah, very neat. And I mean, can you speak a little bit to the uniqueness of the challenge in fly fishing? I mean, is there anything idiosyncratic to fly fishing, or is it just a function that people haven't focused on increasing participation, say as far back as maybe golfers or climbers or some of these other groups that you mentioned?
Yeah, it is. I think that's, you bring up a good point, Marvin. And so back when I was at TU, I used to set up a set of rules about how we were going to promote Trout Unlimited. And I had one very, very clear rule. I didn't want to see anymore that river shot where you see the lone angler way out there by himself with his back to us, casting to some distant fish. Because you knew that was basically an old white guy, who's on his favorite stretch of the river, would be mad if you walked up to that river to fish it. And all he wanted to do was go and fish, but you knew that it may be that he didn't want to see anybody else out there, That lone ranger, lone angler, idea of angling is kind of dead and it's kind of dying out. And it's because we don't fish that way anymore. We get a group of buddies, guys and gals, we plan a trip. We're going to bring beer. We're going to bring our music. We're going to bring our loud voices. We're going to bring our dog. It's transitioned from being a solo sport to really being a group sport. And it's more inclusive in that nature. And so, do we spook more fish on the river? Yeah. And is that going to piss off, old Joe? Yeah, it's going to piss him off. But like, if we're trying to, bring along more anglers and creating a sense of inclusivity, then those are the types of images that we now need to put out there. Those are the kind of shots that we now need to include in Trout Magazine, and what's endemic to fly fishing is looking for the quiet repose, getting away from it all, escape. Well, right now you've got people fly fishing for carp in downtown Denver. You can go into Brooklyn and go to Prospect Park and fish for bass in that lake. and there's going to be 30 different languages spoken around you, and you're going to smell curry, and you're going to smell hot dogs, and you're going to have dogs barking at you, or you can go fish your favorite trout stream, and you're going to see, maybe a woman angler on that river, or maybe a person of color fishing too. And it's just the world is changing, and fishing opportunities are also changing. And none of them are right, none of them are wrong. There's just more of it. So, part of the scenario is that with fly fishing changing, we need to respond and respect those changes and reflect them. Otherwise, we're going to see diminishing returns. We're going to see fewer and fewer people walk into our fly shop feeling comfortable enough to ask a question. We're going to see fewer and fewer people, buying that $750 fly rod because, they're just as comfortable in a $200 fly rod. So the industry writ large has got to change in order, along with the times in order to sustain itself. And then the conservation industry has to change in order to bring on new communities and new members. Otherwise, I've seen the numbers. I've had an intimate look at, the numbers. They don't look good, and we will lose a really wonderful, actually, I shouldn't say we'll lose it. It's just going to change. It's just going to transform. But, there will be a lot less people participating if we don't get it right. And so I think that's kind of the funky, fun thing about fishing right now, is that just like our country, it's become incredibly democratic, and that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, interesting. And as you design marketing programs, and at the risk of grossly overgeneralizing everything, can you talk a little bit about how these different demographic groups in the sport interact with the sport, so listeners can get an idea of, the older white angler, the younger angler, the angler of color, if there are any kind of systematic differences in the way they like to interact with the sport?
Absolutely. So here's the template that I use, or the metaphor that I use when I'm trying to talk about this particular subject to fly anglers. I'm like, what's your favorite online fly fishing magazine? And, someone might say Southern Culture on the Fly, and, you get a bunch of other ones out there. But look, there must be 30 of them, and they're all different. And some are about regional, fishing. Some are about particular communities of fishing. Some are about particular species of fish. And I talk about marketing in the same way, in the sense that, okay, you're just going to have to get a lot more diverse in how you tell your story, not only in the format and the medium, but also in those stories as well. So, when I'm pitching fly fishing brands on what they can do, and conservationists on how they can be more inclusive, I start with that. I'm like, start with the community. Great example is bonefish and tarpon. The different communities that depend on those fish are as varied as the rainbow. From sport anglers, recreational anglers, commercial anglers, conservationists, traveling and visiting and tourist anglers, local anglers, indigenous anglers, guides, the guiding community, the owners of the outfitters. It is a whole diverse community of people that support, or connect to these one or two fish. And so I say, you got to do the same thing with your storytelling. Let's be on Facebook. Let's be on Instagram. Let's find a way to write articles and get editorial out there that tell your story and communicate it in your own way. And then when we feature people, let's not just talk about, the kick-ass pioneering scientist who's out there, or the lone wolf angler who's exploring new places, but let's talk about the community that's already there and how they've connected to that species of fish for a long time, and what they know about it, And let's talk to the guide who's got that everyday on the water 365 type of intelligence about that species, and bring these folks together, so that they can talk about the benefits of having a relationship with that fish, whether it's recreational, conservation, or otherwise. And what I typically suggest that folks do is, start on the ground, and literally just do interviews, just talk to people, go in and interview people. Don't try to come up with the answer on your own in a room with a whiteboard. It starts with long conversations, and they can happen at the bar, they can happen on the bank, they can happen in the fly shop, wherever they need to happen. It's those conversations that are going to be the key to coming up with a really great strategy that should then inform your creative campaign, wherever that campaign is going to be. The little cool insights and tidbits and backstories, that's going to form the raw fodder and material that's going to make for a great story that's going to persuade somebody to listen and care about a specific fishery or a specific kind of fishing. One of the things I love, for example, about education in fly fishing right now is that it's coming from so many different places. And so here's an example on that front. You've got Project Healing Waters, Casting for Recovery, and other numerous organizations beyond Trout Unlimited that are creating fishing opportunities. And they're coming at it from a completely different point of view, obviously, but they are still educating new anglers every day for different reasons, because there's a lot of different ways to come into the sport. Still gives you that same core, learning how to fly fish, but how you apply it or why you apply it can be just as varied. So that's another reason why I think, right now, there's no one thing to do, but we can't just do one thing. We have to do many different things in order to grow the participation in the sport. We can't lock it down. I've heard feedback from people in the industry like, oh, I make all my money from that old white guy. I can't afford to spend time with, all these young guys and women and, and going to the city and carp fish and I'm like, well, then you're just going to have to look at the long-term trend line of where your numbers are and ask yourself, is that sustainable? And look, maybe your mainline business can't do that, but there are ways to support others who are doing it where their mainline business is about a little more niche. And obviously, when we talk about the trades and the fly fishing shows, we're seeing more people of color, more women as entrepreneurs and business leaders, creating fishing brands, creating new fishing products that are out there. And, I think we have a responsibility to be supportive of that, to make sure that there's a big, wide, inclusive community, because I think that's the future of our sport.
Got it. And how do you see the kind of the traditional civic club model fitting into the transformation of fly fishing in the future? Do you think there's going to be a place for it, or do you think it's going to kind of change with the way people want to interact with the sport?
So if I have a regret about leaving TU, it is that I really wanted to work on that issue of the club model. When a 55-year-old guy tells you he doesn't want to go to a TU meeting because he feels like everyone there is about to die, you know you got a problem. Or a 65-year-old guy. I've heard that from a 65-year-old guy. And look, what's interesting is that the organization, the club model worked for time and it was right for a certain time. It's no longer right. It's just that simple. The club model is no longer right. And we live our lives very differently. We don't participate in social clubs, the way we used to in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which really started changing in the 80s, after the big recession. The reality is going into here's an example. The TU chapter nearest me meets in the Senior Citizen Center across the street. And it's like, that's probably not where I want to spend my evenings. Now, there's dozens of interesting good examples of chapters that are like, we're going to meet at the brew pub, and they're shifting it because they know it should be a social experience. and not feel like, you joined Rotary. And there are a lot of really good clubs out there. I think that the challenge that TU has is it needs to lighten up a little bit and loosen up all those structures. It's just got too many layers of structure, because there are great examples of clubs within TU that have actually solved their problems about being able to actively grow by shifting their club models to being more about experiences instead of meetings. And I say like that, what I mean is picnics, barbecues, fishing trips, excursions, fly time nights, movie nights, where the club work is really 10% and 90% of it is about what it's supposed to be about, which is the social engagement, and having, and letting go of the fear that just because they have social engagement, they're not going to get any work done. And then, the other reality, of course, if you've ever been to a TU meeting, is there's always certain TU types that just, they take up all the air in the room and they want to just be president for life. Well, when you have those kind of structures, that's what's inevitable. Someone's always going to want to be president for life. And so part of it is letting go of some of the hierarchy. And again, the interesting thing is that, like the fly fishing industry, the club model, there are plenty of examples out there of other kind of organizations that have shifted away and found alternatives that are doing fine. Because, part of it's looking beyond what you're currently doing for ideas and bringing in, outside perspectives in order to be able to see them and see what the opportunities are. What I love is that, you have to also appreciate that a lot of it's tied to power, a lot of it's tied to money, but a good deal of it is also tied to tradition. And traditions should be respected, but every tradition started somewhere, and you can start new traditions. And so I think what I would always ask is how do you start a new tradition, and let those traditions become more important over time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, kind of a follow-up on that, curious about your thoughts on kind of the balance in the industry between diversifying and growing the sport because it's the right thing to do versus kind of a more cynical look of, hey, we need to sell more stuff. And we feel like we've saturated, I don't know, we'll just be colloquial and say the old white guy market. So we're going to go over here. And just kind of curious, it's really kind of a sincerity question, kind of curious, kind of like where you see that in the industry and, who are some folks that you think are getting that right?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think what you brought up is a really good point. There's a difference between growing participation and growing members in the sport, growing participation of TU members, growing more conservationists, growing more anglers, than making it more inclusive. Those are not necessarily the same goals. And I tend to prefer and really care more about the latter than the former. I'm of the mind that if we can take a angler and talk about what makes a better angler, then I think that could be a pathway to not only growing participation, but also making it more inclusive. So what do I mean by that? I mean that sharing the water means being a mentor, being a teacher, not shutting down when women and people of color come onto the water, but opening up and engaging, and hey, maybe they'll say, no, they're not interested in engaging. That's up to them. But starting by engaging is starting somewhere. And then, being a better angler overall means, knowing more about that water, right? What does it take to protect it? What does it take to keep the resource intact in order to enjoy the sport? And then sharing that knowledge. That's being a better angler, right? And I think that leads to having more people who love and care about that water, creating more protectors of that resource. I think it leads to making it also more inclusive. There are some really great brands and organizations that are doing this. Project Healing Waters is, if you ever go to one of their events, it's incredibly diverse. and this is by the nature of where they draw from in terms of their community, which is the armed forces community. Casting for Recovery, similar, drawing from the cancer community. And then you look at brands like Rep Your Water, which has two brilliant people running that running that brand, and business people, artists, anglers, having an outsized effect on conservation by giving back, every year, what matters most, cash, money, to conservation organizations, by taking a percentage of the proceeds from their products. With big companies, it's like, oh, we got some leftover T-shirts. How about we'll donate that, and if someone buys it, we'll give you a percentage of the money. Well, that's just bullshit. You know what I mean? That's just bullshit. And the difference is where you commit a percentage of your bottom line to keeping the resource intact. Well, now, why is that important to making the sport more inclusive? What's the connection between conservation and inclusivity? Well, let's look at the larger trend of what young people want out of their experiences. Millennials and Gen Xers, but particularly millennials, they want brands and care about brands, and they shop brands that care about, have good values and care about the environment. They actively will inquire, what does that brand do for the river, for the water, for the environment? And they won't shop the brands that just are bullshitting, or that are just showing up, or that are just there because they're cool. They shop the ones that have shown a commitment, and the research bears this out. So, part of it is saying, we know if we can bring more young people in, we're going to increase inclusivity as well, because we know the population of the country is trending towards being more inclusive. So, part of it is looking at it and saying, just again, where am I going to find my consumer? Where am I going to find my member? Where am I going to find my protector? Where am I going to find my future audience? If you start to be a better angler, you're going to naturally start asking those questions. And I think the role for folks like me, you, and think the leaders of our industry, and I can spout off 50, 60 names. They're going to be those top guides and outfitters. They're going to be those top brand managers and those guys who own those companies that we see in Edison and out at the shows, in Pennsylvania, who run the film festivals. We can put a list of, 150 influencers in this sport, right? Those folks, we need to be mentors, and we need to make mentorship a part of our sport. We didn't all learn it on our own. And if we make mentorship part of our sport now, a founding principle of what it means to be a fly angler, what it means to be a better fly angler, we can have a big impact on, not only growing participation in the sport, but also making it more inclusive.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think that mentorship is really kind of the glue that kind of stitches the analog and the digital technologies together, right?
Yeah.
For sure. And before I let you go, why don't you let us know, you talked about Sierra Nevada, but what else have you got in store? Because I know, like, for example, you worked on the Slickest Knot campaign for scientific anglers. What are you and your buddies at Admirable Devil going to be doing in 2020 you want to share with our listeners?
Sure. So one of the things that we'll probably do, and that we've been doing for a couple of years now, is we've been connecting with the Outdoor Industry Association. So, and this is not a knock against, AFTA or any of the, sport and recreational fishing organizations, but we've had a desire to sort of see what, the biggest companies and the biggest brands are doing in getting more people outside and connecting with the resource and protecting it. And so we'll probably be this summer heading to Outdoor Retailer in Denver. They have a new program called Thrive Outside, which is dedicated to getting young people and diverse communities of color in the outdoors. and we'll be supporting that in some way, I'm sure. Who knows, may turn into a project, but for right now, it'll definitely just be monetary support. Like we want to see those kind of organizations succeed. So, and then we'll probably wind up doing some pro bono work for the right conservation organization this year. As those opportunities come up, we look and see if we can, make the time to do it and try to do our best. I think, individually, just for myself, what I have been participating in is trying to create and convene small gatherings of people to have conversations around inclusivity in the sport of fishing, and particularly fly fishing. Right now, it's very all informal and kind of more on the conversation level, and building up networks of people, which is an important part of building, creating the foundation for any movement. And so that's kind of the day-to-day work that I've been up to and will keep doing. And then in general, I know people at many of the outdoor fly fishing companies. A lot of them are really good friends, and I love what everybody is doing. There's some companies that stand out to me, like Sightline Provisions and the work that Edgar Diaz is doing. Johnny LeCoq's Fish Pond, of course, what that company continues to do, the Orvis Company and others. I'll always be out there, meeting with these folks, talking with these folks, saying, hey, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help? I look at the agency. It's kind of funny, but honestly, I look at the agency as a means to an end to stay a part of the fly fishing industry. It's what I care the most about, the people in it. Both all the old timers who took the time to teach me, to grow my passion for it, educate me, all the way to the young kids that I work with now. Like the fly fishing industry, to me, it's just that place that I hope to be a part of, going forward, and just have lots of different roles. So.
Very neat. And why don't you let folks know if they want to follow your fishing adventures or the adventures of Admirable. Gosh, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with that.
That's all right. I confuse it myself sometimes.
Yeah. So, just let folks know where they can find you on the internet so they can follow you or follow Admirable Devil, and see what you guys are up to.
Most of the time, it's like, if you want a snapshot of what we're up to, it's on Instagram at admirablodevil.com. Or my own Instagram, which can actually be found at two different places, at Deadbait, which is DADBAIT, which will just push you over to at Joel R. Johnson. So Instagram is kind of where I am most of the time. And then, that's where you'll know, oh, he was fishing on the green, or he was up on the Farmington or whatever. That's kind of how to find me. And then anybody, if anything that I shared today is useful to anybody, or anybody wants to follow up or have a conversation with me, I'm a click or a phone call away. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And I just want to say thank you, Marvin, for having the Articulate Fly podcast, and, creating a space where we can, talk about these kinds of things and let them be recorded so that other people can connect to them too. It's pretty cool. I think it's a nice part of the total mix, man. I want to hear about fishing stories. I want to hear about flies, but having these kind of conversations are just as much fun too.
No, absolutely. And I've enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you carving some time out on a Friday afternoon to chat with me.
Yeah, man. So next up, we need to go fishing, right? Let's figure that out.
Absolutely.
Oh, can I put out one more plug? That's okay.
You bet.
So I put this plug out everywhere because I do think it's part of what makes it special to live in DC and be a part of the Potomac fishery. Like I said earlier, every year we get an anadromous shad run that comes out of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and into our rivers, the Chesapeake, the James, the Rappahannock, and for me, the Potomac River. And it's thousands and thousands of fish that look like little tarpons, and they jump like little tarpons. And we get hickory and American shad. The run happens between April and then we'll go through to the middle of May. And if it gets hot and wet, then it might end It might end in early June. I'm always here, and if anybody ever wants to get in a boat and go fish that run with me, look me up, give me a call. Marvin, same deck goes out to you. I love promoting the shad run. I think it's a special thing. When you think about like waves and great migrations of animal species, we think about hibernating bears, we think about salmon in Bristol Bay. But the East Coast has got its own little migration of millions of fish that, goes often unsung, and that's the shad run. And I like the shad run because it was part of the founding of this country. Native Americans and indigenous populations relied on the shad run for years. The colonies, the original 13 colonies, relied on the shad run. George Washington was a famous shad angler. And it's just part of one of the cool things on the East Coast that we have that's often underlooked. So come fish it with me. Give me a call.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again, Joel. I really appreciate you making the time today.
Okay. Take care. Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's been great. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, a shout out to this episode's sponsor, our friends at Norvice. Remember, it's the only vice that truly spins. Check them out at www.nor-vice.com. And again, thanks so much for listening. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend and leave us a review in the podcatcher of your choice. Tight lines, everybody.